So the purpose of today's class, and we're nearing the end of that foundation groundwork stuff, is and again, I know some of you have had me for logic, so all this stuff is redundant for y'all, but to give you some useful things when it comes to recognizing arguments and then writing them in standard form, and then ultimately evaluating arguments, because you're going to be doing that over the course of the entire semester. So since I can't require that folks take a class in logic before they take this class, I at least have to, in some minimal way, expose you to some of these important skills and concepts. So let me bump this up a little bit. So I am not going to go through the entire chapter. You have the chapter available to you. But the main thing is that in the end, arguments are composed of statements. And you can't evaluate an argument unless you can recognize one. And typically for us, arguments aren't going to be expressed in the form of a small little single paragraph. It'll be an argument spread out over several paragraphs or several pages. One of your jobs for me, in terms of your presentation, is to identify the main claims and the main reasons that are being given by whoever it is you're doing your presentation on, to raise questions in terms of the evaluation of the argument or the reasonableness of what's being claimed or what's being assumed as a part of your presentation. So it's important that you be able to recognize arguments when you encounter them. So this chapter begins with, and I'm actually going to skip through a lot of this here, is the notion that, well, you can't have an argument unless you've got a set of statements. Every argument in the universe consists of two parts. One's going to be that claim that's supposed to be true on the basis of the other statements in the argument, and those other statements are going to be the reasons or assumptions. Now, it's going to turn out that every argument is a set of statements, but not every set of statements is an argument. So all you see here in D, E, and F are three sets of statements. And when it comes to sets of statements, one question we can always ask about a set of statements is whether it's consistent, because every set of statements is either consistent or inconsistent. In order to be consistent, all it means is that it's possible for all of the statements in a set to be true at the same time. And if a set of statements isn't consistent, then it is inconsistent. And if it's inconsistent, that means, well, that not all of the statements can be true at the same time, but typically it means that there's going to be a contradiction somewhere among those set of statements. And the thing is, for reasons that you'll see today, anytime you've got an argument and the evidence can't all be true, you've got a bad argument, right? Because inconsistent evidence is always bad evidence. But right here, or at this point, we're not talking about arguments yet because we don't have an argument. But you can't have an argument without a set of statements, even if it's a set of only one statement. So if I were to do a conceptual analysis on what an argument is, I've already told you that an argument's a set of statements where one statement is claimed to be true on the basis of the other statements within the set. But to be a little bit more anal about it, we could do this analysis. We could say that a set of statements is an argument if and only if these conditions are met. There are two or more statements in the set, and at least one statement is offered as evidence for the truth of the other. That sort of captures what is necessary and together sufficient for an argument to be an argument. Now, as I've already said, and I'm going to be using these words interchangeably, every argument has to have a claim or a conclusion. Otherwise, it isn't an argument. And every argument has to have at least one reason that's being assumed or presupposed in order to show that the claim is true. No statement by itself is ever an argument. No statement by itself is ever a claim or a premise. A statement can only be a premise or a claim or conclusion only in relation to its role within an argument. The point is, you can't have an argument without a claim or conclusion. You can't have an argument without evidence or premise. The reasons, the assumptions given in order to show that the claim is true. I'm using the words interchangeably for a reason. And take a look at what we have here at G. You've already seen an argument written in standard form. Writing arguments in standard form is a very useful thing for you to master, because in the end, you can't evaluate an argument unless you can reconstruct it. That is, unless you can recognize what argument's being asserted. But it's often easier to evaluate a reconstructed argument like this in standard form than it is to look at a block of text in prose. because there the structure of the argument doesn't stand out. I can hand this argument to anyone, and they'll be able to figure out what the conclusion is. Why? Because when you write an argument in standard form, the conclusion is always written at the bottom, to the right of the little therefore symbol. And there's a line separating the premises, the reasons, the evidence from the conclusion to indicate that the truth of the claim, the conclusion, is supposed to follow from the truth of the statements above it. So this is just simply an argument in standard form. Now, you're going to see arguments written in standard form. There are going to be occasions when I'm going to probably ask you to reconstruct an argument and to put it in standard form. And the main reason for that is they're easier to evaluate. They're easier for everyone to see the logical structure and then, in the end, for us to evaluate them. However, most arguments you're going to encounter in this class are not going to be you're not going to be spoon-fed arguments where the logical structure is completely revealed like this. Sometimes that will be the case, as will be the case tomorrow, or on Thursday when we talk about the scientific method. And there'll be other occasions. But more often than not, the arguments that you're going to encounter in this class, especially through the readings we're going to have, are going to be arguments expressed in prose or in a paragraph or spread out over several paragraphs. So your job when it comes to presenting is to recognize the claims, the reasons that are being given in order to show that it's true, and to capture all that in the form of an outline that you'll print off for all of your peers. We'll discuss that in class. Now, in order for you to be able to recognize arguments, there are some useful things that you need to know. Now, I'm presupposing that you've read the chapter. I don't think you really need me to go through every single point here. But one of the things I will emphasize is that arguments have indicators. And all an indicator is something that reliably signals the presence of something else. Like your gas warning light or your engine warning light is an indicator. Sometimes it's faulty. So not every time the engine warning light goes off doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with the engine. But it's reliable. More often than not, when it does go off, there is an issue, right? So indicators don't have to be infallible in order for them to be reliable. Well, the thing about arguments is they have indicators, and these indicators come in two flavors. There are words, phrases, or even symbols that reliably indicate the presence of a conclusion of the argument. And those are called conclusion indicators. And among them is the therefore symbol, which you've already seen, right? But also accordingly, consequently, hence, so, therefore, thus, we may infer that, I conclude that, and so on, right? So, strictly speaking, none of these words or phrases are part of the conclusion. They indicate what the conclusion is. So the conclusion typically will be what follows one of these conclusion indicators. So when you reconstruct the argument, you don't reconstruct it with the conclusion indicators because you write the conclusion at the bottom to the right of the therefore symbol. That identifies what the conclusion is. You don't need, if the sentence has hence or therefore, to write the word in. Similarly, just as there are words and phrases that reliably indicate the presence of the conclusion or the claim, there are words and phrases that reliably indicate the presence of a reason, that is a premise within the argument. And these include because, or first, second, third, for the following reasons, let us assume that, let us suppose that. You get the idea. Now your job isn't to memorize these lists, but the more familiar you are with these lists, the easier it will be when your job is, when you're reading the text, to identify what the claim is that's being made, to identify the reasons that are being given in order to show that it's true, to make notes in the margins, because starting next week when we get into the pieces themselves, and I'm going to emphasize this here right now, I want you to mark up your texts as you're reading through the text in order to reveal as much of the logical structure of what the argument is, so that when we go back into the text, you don't have this virgin blank page without anything on it where you have to reread everything. Mark the damn thing up. Be more concerned about getting what the text says and recognizing its structure logically than with the resale value of your book. Right? You're going to get more out of it. The more you're actively marking up the book, the more you're going to get out of what you're actually reading. And we're always going to be going back into the text. Going to such and such page. Where in such and such paragraph does he give his main reason for, whatever kind of stuff. We're going to be doing that, okay? So I tell you in this chapter, that's what's captured in that note right there, to be an active reader. Now, I say this to all my classes, that, again, all philosophy classes are, in a sense, a text-based class, where you're reading stuff, you come to class, and you discuss what you've read. At least that's the way they ought to be. I mean, if you can get through a philosophy class and not have to read anything, someone's not doing their job, right? Because it shouldn't be that way. So the text, reading the text matters because you can't be prepared for the class unless you've read the material. But I want you to mark it up. And you don't have to mark it up exactly the way that I suggest here, but it's useful when, and I'll show you some text of mine marked up when I was at your level as an undergraduate and how I did it. And I'm really anal, so I had different colored pens, notes on the sides and whatnot, but I can open up any of those texts and see the logical structure of what it was that I read then, which saves me from having to completely reread the whole thing over again. So the more time you spend marking the damn thing up, the easier it's going to be for you to refer to a particular passage or whatever as a part of our discussion of whatever the piece is. So here I say, well, use one colored marker for the premise indicators, the light blue, a different colored marker for the conclusion indicators, say a darker blue, and then whenever you encounter the conclusion, underline it, bracket and underline it. Whenever you encounter a premise, bracket and number it, and notice that you've supplied structure to where structure didn't exist before. Makes it easier for you to go back into the text. Now you can be very, very anal about this, or you can just use one color highlighter or a pen or whatever. It doesn't really matter, but there needs to be some convention that you're using so that when you open up your text, you're able, by picking out the thickly underlined passage, that it's important or that it's a claim that's being made. Or you're writing the little therefore symbol off in the margin so you know what the conclusion is. Am I making sense? Okay, do that, right? Now, all I'm doing is presenting you in chapter 3 with some useful things to know, and your job is to recognize arguments, and you're going to be doing that all semester long. So the first thing had to do with knowing the difference between premise indicators and conclusion indicators, and learning how to mark up the passage. And if we went through this exercise, one of the things that you'll discover is that the conclusion is always the last statement. So take a look at passage number 1. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. What's the conclusion? Well, Socrates is mortal. How do you know that? It's to the right of therefore. In the second passage, because Socrates is human and every human is mortal, he is mortal. What's the conclusion of the argument asserted in passage 2? Yes, Socrates is mortal, not he. So when you're reconstructing an argument, always replace the pronouns with names, revealing as much of the logical structure as possible. Notice that because is a premise indicator, right? So that means that what follows it's going to be a premise. So that means Socrates is human is a premise, and that's conjoined with and, which means that what's to its right is going to be a premise too. I mean, you got to reason through this. There's sort of an art involved, and you get better at it the more you do it. But don't just mindlessly take a look at the words in the passage and say, well, that's the last statement, therefore it must be the conclusion. It doesn't work like that. And you're going to have to paraphrase more often than not, provided that you paraphrase in a fair and accurate and an unbiased way, all is well. But if you paraphrase in a way that intentionally weakens the argument, you've done something bad. And let me just emphasize again that you're not going to just be reconstructing and evaluating arguments and positions within the presentations. You're going to have to do this when it comes to your essay for me. So mark up your text. Mark up your text so that we can point to specific places in the text when, and I assure you this will happen, when the lectures turn to not just me standing up here lecturing to you, but we're actually discussing the pieces. Take a look at 3. All copper conducts electricity. This piece of wire is made entirely out of copper. Therefore, it will conduct electricity. What's the conclusion of the argument that's asserted in passage 3?
This piece of wire will conduct electricity.
Exactly right. Not it. Right? You've got to replace the pronoun with that. What about number 4? If copper conducts electricity and this piece of wire is made entirely out of copper, then it will conduct electricity. What's the conclusion of the argument asserted in passage 4?
This piece of wire will conduct electricity.
Exactly right. Notice that the argument asserted in 3 and the argument asserted in 4 is the same argument. Just as, and this is an important point when we were talking about statements, Any number of sentences can be used to assert the same statement. Any number of passages can be used in order to assert the same argument. In the end, what matters for us is the message. It's what's being asserted, not the particular sentence or the passage used to assert it. So, in any event, if we went through all of these items, you'd notice that the conclusion is always written to the right, to the last statement in the passage. In the real world, however, it's not how it really happens. So, before I send you forth into the world reconstructing arguments and writing them in standard form, you need to know what writing them in standard form means, and this is all it means. Mark up the passages however you're going to mark them up, but you always write, when you write an argument in standard form, the conclusion at the bottom, to the right of the therefore symbol. And you separate the conclusion from the premises with that line to indicate that the truth of the claim, the conclusion, is supposed to follow from the truth of the statements above it. Then you number the premises. And very often you're going to have to paraphrase, and your job is to reveal as much of the logical structure of the argument as possible. Once you get it in this form, then you can give this form to an audience, and they're going to be able to see the logical structure better than if you just gave them a block of text in English prose. So it's better to recognize the argument when you write it this way, but it also makes it easier to evaluate. And in the end, that's what I want to get to today, how to do that. So if we were to go from the passage that's marked up here, and in order to write it in standard form, notice that the premise indicators and the conclusion indicator does not make it into the argument as it's expressed in standard form. Why? Because you know what the conclusion is, because it's to the right of the therefore symbol here at the bottom. You know that the premises are the numbered statements above it. So let's assume that, and because, and it follows that, are words that occur in the passage, but strictly speaking, they're not part of the argument. They're indicating what the conclusion is and what the premises are. So always paraphrase. Okay, you with me? It's not rocket surgery. Know how to write an argument in standard form. All right. Now here I'm going to be really quick in terms of the material presented in Chapter 3. And that besides knowing what premise indicators are and what words and phrases function as premise indicators, and besides knowing what conclusion indicators are and what words and phrases function as conclusion indicators, there are some other useful things to know when your job is to recognize an argument. So I'll pause for one of these, but I'm just going to essentially go through this list, entertain any questions you have, and then let's get out of this chapter because, one, it's not very long, and again, it's not rocket surgery. So one useful thing to know besides what the premise indicators and conclusion indicators are is that an argument has exactly one conclusion and it can occur anywhere within the passage. Sometimes it will occur at the end, but sometimes it will occur at the beginning, and other times it will occur in the middle. So you can't tell what the conclusion is by its position within the passage. What matters is, in order for it to be an argument, there has to be at least one statement that's being claimed to be true on the basis of the other statements. That's the conclusion, regardless of where it occurs in the passage. Is that okay? Second one, every argument can be expressed in the form of a single conditional declarative sentence. Now, you're not going to want to do this. You're not going to counter them all the time, but that passage here at K is an argument expressed in standard form. What I've got at K1, K2, and K3 is the same argument, but in each case expressed in the form of a single sentence that asserts a conditional statement. In order to turn any argument into a single sentence that asserts a conditional statement, all you do is you make a conjunction of the premises as the antecedent. Because again, conditional statements are a kind of truth-functional compound statement. Conditional statements consist of an antecedent and a consequent. So, in order to express it in the form of a conditional, you make a conjunction of the premises and you write the conclusion as the consequent. Done. And I'm emphasizing this because, again, it's not the number of periods that determines whether you have an argument or how many arguments you have. In this case, in K1, K2, K3, I've got one period because I've got one sentence. But it doesn't matter. The sentences don't matter to us. What matters is what's being asserted. And in order for you to have an argument, you need at least one statement that's being asserted to be true on the basis of the other statements. That one statement's going to be the conclusion or the claim. Those other statements are going to be the premises or the reasons given in order to show that the claim is true. So, the conclusion can occur anywhere in a passage. And just because you've got a single sentence doesn't mean you don't have an argument. The next point here, and this is a very easy one, is that no statement by itself is ever a conclusion or a premise. A statement's just a statement. But no statement is ever always the conclusion or ever always a premise either. That something becomes a premise or a conclusion only in relation to its role within a particular argument. So the conclusion of one argument can be a premise in another. In fact, this happens often. So no statement is ever always a conclusion or a premise. So in the examples here, in L, M, and N, the statement God exists is the conclusion. In O, P, and Q, the statement God exists is a premise. So a premise and conclusion are relative terms, only in relation to other statements in a set that asserts an argument. The next point, here I will pause for just a second, is that every premise in an argument is an assumption. The stated premises, the ones that are explicit, are, well, explicit assumptions. Calling something an assumption is not to call it a bad name. Now, think about that for a second. When you argue, your job is to show that your claim is true. In order to do that, you must assume that your evidence, your reasons are true. Because you can't be expected to show that each one of your reasons is true without making each one of your reasons the conclusion of an argument. And then you're going to need each one of those reasons to be the conclusion of another argument and so on. And your argument would never end. So when you argue, it's entirely reasonable for you to assume that your premises are true in order to show that your claim is true. That's the one statement you're required to show to be true, your claim. To do that, you assume the truth of your reasons, your evidence. So calling something an assumption is not to call it a bad name. In fact, you can't have an argument without assumptions. Now, it sounds odd to call certain statements assumptions, like water is H2O, for instance, or the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. I mean, but these are facts. They're not assumptions. Well, if something's a premise, then it's a statement whose truth you're assuming to be true in order to show that your claim is true. And that makes it, within the context of that argument, an assumption. Calling something an assumption is not to call it a bad name. Even if the statement is something that's unproven, as opposed to something like the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. If its job is to supply evidence within an argument, it's an assumption. Now the thing is, not all assumptions are equal, right? Some assumptions are dubious for reasons that you'll see here in a second. But one of the points that I've already made when we're talking about sentences is that questions are sentences, but questions never have this property of having a truth value. They're never either true or false. But just as it's impossible for you to ask someone a question without presupposing certain things of the individual to whom you're asking the question, you can't make an assertion about the way the world was, is, or will be without assuming certain things too. And generally, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes when we assume the truth of something that's both unproven and unreasonable, then we're dubiously assuming the truth of something, and that's always bad. We may never dubiously assume something. So, just to make the point, if I were to ask Andy, how was class today? I'm not explicitly assuming the truth of anything because questions don't have truth values. But I'm implicitly assuming certain things, namely that Andy's a student, that Andy's enrolled in at least one class, that Andy attended class today. But besides those assumptions, I'm also assuming that Andy exists, that Andy speaks English, that Andy's capable of replying, that classes exist, and so on. Now, I don't think I need to identify these assumptions when I ask a question like that any more than you need to identify what all the assumptions are you're making when you ask someone a question. But sometimes when you ask a question, or not you necessarily, but sometimes when people ask questions, they're assuming the answer to a question that wasn't even asked. Hackneyed example. Do you still beat your wife? If you say yes, you're damned. If you say no, you're damned. Why? Because either answer means that you're answering a prior question that wasn't even asked, and that's bad, right? That's going to be an example of what's called a leading question or a complex question. The point is, you can't ask questions without making assumptions. You can't make statements about the world without making assumptions. And none of that's bad. It's just that sometimes when we assume the truth of something that's both unproven and unreasonable, then we're dubiously assuming the truth of something, and that's always bad. And there are several ways in which an assumption can be dubious. So in the text, I illustrate that when you make assertions, you're always explicitly assuming the truth of what you're asserting because, well, that's just how it works. But you're also always going to be implicitly assuming the truth of other things too. And there's nothing unreasonable about that. But sometimes when you ask a question or you make an assertion, you're implicitly assuming the truth of something that's both unproven and unreasonable. And then when that occurs, you've got something specific you can say about why they're reasoning badly. So, point here is that don't be troubled that arguments contain assumptions. In fact, you can't have an argument without assumptions. Because each premise, each stated premise in an argument is going to be an explicit assumption. The conclusion, strictly speaking, isn't an assumption unless you're begging the question and assuming the truth of the very thing you're trying to show to be true, in which case that would be bad. But the idea is that here is that sometimes the only assumptions you need to identify to reconstruct the argument will be, and very often the case, the stated premises, the explicit assumptions. But there'll always be some other assumptions you could identify. But in this case, when the argument is, no Academy Award-winning actor has won a Nobel Prize. Charlize Theron is an Academy Award-winning actor. It is false that Charlize Theron has won a Nobel Prize. I don't need to identify these implicit assumptions, that 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, in order to reveal the logical structure of the argument. Because the reasonableness of the argument doesn't hinge upon my identifying these implicit assumptions. But sometimes an argument will contain implicit assumptions. That is, it will always contain presuppositions. But sometimes part of the evidence that's crucial in order to defend the claim is something that's not stated explicitly. So if we were to reconstruct the argument asserted here at R2, no Academy Award-winning actor has won a Nobel Prize. Therefore, it's false that Charlize Theron has won a Nobel Prize. If we were to reconstruct the argument asserted at R2, that way, we've left something crucial out of the evidence that would bear upon the evaluation of whether the argument's good. Namely, this implied premise here that Charlize Theron is an Academy Award-winning actor. So again, don't just go with the words and the order of the words in the passage used to assert the argument. Paraphrase. What's the claim that's being made? And then, what are the reasons that are being given in order to show that it's true? Sometimes those reasons will be implied rather than stated explicitly. And this is okay. And we'll get to this here in a few minutes, that again, not every assumption is a bad thing. Dubious assumptions, however, always are. And there are various ways in which an assumption can be made dubious. So we'll get to those when we get to chapter 4. In fact, here's an example. If you take a look at the passage, the argument that's asserted here in passage S, either you want to be a doctor or you want to be a lawyer. Because you want to be a doctor, it follows. I think I said that right. Because you do not want to be a doctor, it follows that you want to be a lawyer. This argument, strictly speaking, is valid. But the validity here hinges upon a false dilemma. Because what's being dubiously assumed is there are no other alternatives to what you want to be. And there are. That's not stated explicitly, it's presupposed. And that's a dubious assumption. So on those occasions when you need to identify a presupposition in order to be able to accurately evaluate the argument, then you write them off to the side, you know, in a handwritten note to yourself, and then you make it part of the argument when you reconstruct it. So when you make that explicit, then you're going to be able to tell precisely why this is a bad argument. And the reason why is because it commits a fallacy of presumption called false dilemma. So a couple of other things about recognizing arguments. It's not just premises that can be implied, conclusions can be implied too. So don't say, well, because such and such isn't stated explicitly, it can't be the conclusion. No, sometimes conclusions are implied, they're not stated explicitly. Like, for instance, in T, all cheaters are dishonest and Biff is a cheater. The conclusion is inescapable. The conclusion is inescapable is not the conclusion. Rather, the conclusion is that Biff is dishonest. Either you should stay in college or you should get a job. Because you do not want to get a job, what you should do is obvious. What you should do is obvious is not the conclusion, right? What the conclusion is that you should stay in college. If every object has mass and the snake under your chair is an object, do you have to like snakes to see what follows? That is not the conclusion, right? In fact, no question can ever be a conclusion because questions don't have truth values, which is another reason why, again, anytime you've got questions as a part of your evidence, as your reasons, you've got bad reasons. Because questions don't have truth values. They need to be statements. Your reasons need to be statements. Your claim needs to be a statement. All right, so bear in mind, even though an argument can have an implied conclusion and an argument can have an implied premise, you can't have an argument if both the premises and the conclusion are implied, right? Something's got to be stated explicitly. But your job explicitly when it comes to your essays for me, in part will be to reconstruct an argument that you found in the text, and to present it in a fair and accurate and unbiased way. That is not to set the argument up for a fall. So be as charitable as you need to be in order to present a fair and accurate version of the argument with which you disagree and then show why it's wrong. And you can't do that unless you can recognize the argument. The final 2 points are pretty easy. That it's not the number of passages that determine the number of arguments. And it's not that I think any of you would have thought that otherwise. But it's also the case that not everything in a passage needs to be either a premise or a conclusion. And this is good because very often, as you'll see, our arguments, the arguments we're going to be considering are going to be spread out over several paragraphs or several pages. And sometimes sentences in the passage are simply there to provide context, background, in order for you to understand what's actually going on. Not every sentence needs to correspond to something that's either a premise or a conclusion. And just as not everything within a passage needs to be either a premise or a conclusion in a single argument, any single passage can, well, I should put it that way, but a passage can contain more than one argument. So it's not the number of passages that determines how many arguments there are, it's the number of claims that are being made. So sometimes, in fact, you'll see this, that the conclusion of one argument will end up being a premise in another. How do you reconstruct it? Well, you can do it with some overlapping arguments in standard form like this, or more elegantly, since there'll be exactly one main claim, you identify the reasons this way in relation to that claim. But in the end, you can't evaluate an argument unless you can recognize one, so it's important enough for me to spend some time on it. I've got a chapter devoted to it in the logic book, but in the end, you also have to evaluate them, and I need to equip you with some skills in order to be able to do that. So let me ask you, do you have any questions about any of the material here presented in Chapter 3 about how to recognize an argument or to write it in standard form? Then, and again, it's not rocket surgery. Let's turn our attention to this. Now, again, I can't possibly go through this in as much detail as I would if you were taking a logic class, because, in fact, we spent 2 weeks on this chapter in my introduction to logic class. I mean, it's that important. Because this chapter covers all of the principles of good reasoning that apply to arguments. The refute rule, which summarizes all of those principles and all of the various ways in which the R, the I, the F, the U, and the T can be violated. Okay, you're not going to learn all that in a single crash course on Chapter 4 in one day here. But you're going to be encountering arguments. We're going to be reconstructing them. We're going to be evaluating them. And there are some things that I need for you to know, even though I don't expect any of you to master all of this stuff, but you'll have the rest of the opportunity to apply it, the rest of the semester to apply it, okay? So stop me along the way. The chapter begins, let me increase the size of this a little bit, by reminding you what an argument is. I think that'll work. That again, every argument in the universe consists of 2 parts. Anytime you make a claim and you give one or more reasons in order to show that the claim is true, you've offered an argument. But you can't have a claim, you can't have an argument without a claim, and by claim I mean the conclusion. That's the deduction. That's the statement that's supposed to follow on the basis of the other statements. It's the statement that you infer to be true on the basis of the other statements. Lots of words, they're not all interchangeable, but we'll use claim, conclusion interchangeably. You also can't have an argument unless you've given at least one statement as evidence. There's a reason, an assumption that you've made in order to show that the claim is true. And very often, evaluated in arguments is just simply evaluating the relation between the premises and the conclusion, or the evidence and the claim, in order to see whether any of the principles of good reasoning that apply to arguments is violated. So you want to be able to avoid violating those principles yourself, but you also need to be able to recognize when someone else does in order to settle whatever the issue is. So the first principle of good reasoning that applies to arguments is in the text what I call the cardinal principle of good reasoning. And I'll state it this way. The truth of a claim needs to follow from the truth of its evidence. That's why you argue. You're claiming that such and such is the case, and in order to show that, you need to offer one or more reasons as evidence. So in the end, no argument that violates this principle is ever good, period. The problem is, what does it mean for a claim to follow from its evidence? And then it gets a little complicated because it depends on what kind of argument we're talking about. Are we talking about a deductive argument or an inductive argument? Well, in the case of deductive arguments, the truth of the claim, or the conclusion, follows from the truth of the premises, or the evidence, if and only if, just in case the argument's valid. And to be valid means simply that it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. That's what a valid argument is. In fact, that's all you know about a valid argument if all you know that it's valid. You don't know that the claim is true, but you know that if an argument is valid, it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. That's the power of validity. That's why we talk about validity so much. Because if an argument's valid and the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, must be true. Not on its own, all by itself, but in relation to the premises of that argument. If it's valid and those premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, because it wouldn't be valid otherwise. To be valid means it must be impossible, not hard, impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. Now, since we're going to be dealing with deductive arguments all throughout the semester, you'll see some inductive ones too, but we talked about, well, actually we didn't so much in this class, but we will. We'll talk more about the problem of induction and some other things. But the point is that I'm making here is that whether a claim follows from its evidence has nothing to do, strictly speaking, with the truth value of the premises themselves. Here, for instance, you've got an argument. The conclusion is 2 is a prime number. Here are the reasons given in order to show that it's true. 3 is a prime number. 5 is a prime number. 7 is a prime number. 11 is a prime number. Therefore, 2 is a prime number. This claim does not follow from those reasons. In fact, these reasons happen to be true. But what makes a claim follow from its evidence has nothing to do with the truth value of the premises themselves. Rather, you need something more than that. So it doesn't follow that an argument is valid just because the premises are true. What makes an argument valid, what makes a claim follow from its evidence, is when it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. So I'm going to skip through this because, again, I can't teach you everything you would need to know about validity or methods for assessing validity here, right? This isn't the right place for it. I'm just letting you know that for the most part, we're going to be concerned with deductive arguments. And the measure of whether a deductive argument is good in the sense of the claim follows from the evidence is whether it's valid. And to be valid means simply that it is impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. So the principle that we just considered here, this cardinal principle, that the truth of the claim needs to follow from the truth of the evidence, is a very important principle. In fact, that's why it's called the cardinal principle. But it ain't the only principle. And it turns out valid arguments can violate every single one of these other principles. No valid argument can violate the cardinal principle. Otherwise, it wouldn't be valid. But there are other principles that apply to good reasoning. So what this example is illustrating is that the argument that you see here is a substitution instance of this argument, which we can write in sort of quasi-English form when we actually have the symbols, and you're going to be seeing arguments that look like this. In fact, even tomorrow, you're going to see an argument that looks like this. This argument has a name, or this argument form has a name. It's called modus ponens. So the small p and the small q are variables. And variables in logic function exactly the same way variables in mathematics do. They're placeholders for something of value. Whereas in mathematics, variables are placeholders for numbers and mathematical expressions. Variables in logic here are placeholders for statements. So it doesn't matter what statement you plug in for P and what statement you plug in for Q, the resulting argument is guaranteed to be valid. Why? Because one way of making an argument valid is to make it a substitution instance of a valid argument form. This is a valid argument form. And in logic, you learn how to prove that this is a valid argument form. But here's how we typically say this argument form in English. If P then Q, P therefore Q. That is, when you have a conditional statement and you have the antecedent of that conditional statement occurring on its own, you can deduce, infer, conclude that the consequent of that conditional statement must be true. If Sophie's a cat, then the moon is not made of green cheese. Sophie's a cat, therefore the moon is not made of green cheese. Is an argument. That's a substitution instance of that argument form. That's valid. Okay, does that sort of make sense? The point is, it doesn't matter what statements you plug in for P and Q. It will be impossible for this premise and this premise to both be true and for the conclusion to be false. Now, I could prove that, but think about it like this. Any argument of this form will have a conclusion, right? The only way of making it possible for each premise to be true and the conclusion's false is for the conclusion to be false. So if the conclusion, in this case, that is the Q, is false here, well, it needs to be false where it also occurs up here, that is here. The only way of making each premise true when the conclusion's false, the second premise has to be true. And if P is true here, P's got to be true here. The problem is, on the only way of making the conclusion false, that is Q needs to be false, and the only way of making the second premise true, P has to be true, it turns out it's impossible for the first premise to be true. Why? Because it has a true antecedent and a false consequent, and that makes it false. The point is, in a symbolic logic course, you learn a variety of methods for assessing whether an argument's formally valid or invalid, right? But we can't really get to that. I'm saying here that validity matters. And it's impossible for a valid argument to violate what I'm calling the cardinal principle, because otherwise the claim wouldn't follow from the evidence if the argument weren't valid. But since I can't teach you all of those methods here in this class, what I will tell you is this, that the one thing, one of the things that you can infer from knowing that an argument is valid is that it's impossible to have this combination of truth and falsity in the premises and the conclusion. If an argument is valid, it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. But it is possible for a valid argument to have true premises and a true conclusion. It's possible for a valid argument to have false premises and a true conclusion. It's possible for a valid argument to have false premises and a false conclusion. But one thing that can't happen is for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. So we say of an argument that's valid that the truth of its claim follows from the truth of the evidence. Because if it's valid, it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. So if the premises are true, the claim must be true. So if all you know is that an argument is valid, you may never infer the conclusion is true. It doesn't follow. And if all you know that it's an argument valid, that an argument is valid, you may never infer that it's good. And the reason why is what I just said. There are other principles of good reasoning that apply to arguments. And valid arguments can violate them all. So in the end, for us, an argument that's good in the fullest sense of the word is going to be a cogent argument. A cogent argument is an argument that doesn't violate any of the principles of good reasoning that apply to arguments. If an argument violates a principle of good reasoning, then it's a fallacious argument. An argument that commits a fallacy is fallacious. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. And what the refute rule here does is it summarizes all of the principles of good reason that apply to arguments, and then what's laid out in the rest of the chapter are all of the ways in which this rule can be violated. So we're not going to tackle this rule or this procedure in the order of the R, the I, the F, the U, and the T. Rather, what this procedure allows you to do is to evaluate an argument starting with the questions that are generally easiest to assess in English to the questions that are hardest to assess in English. And above all, that will be, does the claim follow from the evidence? That is the argument valid? You can't, in the end, say that an argument is cogent unless you can answer each one of these questions. And again, I can't teach you all of this in 40 minutes. right? But I can give you some things to think about as you're going to be evaluating arguments. So let's go through the steps, and I'll do this quickly. Now think about it. When you argue, you're trying to show that your claim is true. To do that, you need to assume the truth of your evidence. And in order for your evidence to show that your claim is true, your evidence needs to be true. False evidence is always bad evidence. In the same way of someone intentionally giving false evidence or testimony in a trial, they might land themselves in jail by doing that if they're doing it intentionally. But regardless, false evidence is always bad evidence. So one way of undermining someone's argument is to show that some or all of their evidence is false. False evidence is always bad evidence, regardless of whether the argument's valid. In fact, unless you've taken logic, you don't even know how to answer the question whether an argument's valid. But you can answer the question, does the argument violate the T in the refute rule? The T corresponds to the principle that says the evidence offered in support of the claim needs to be true. So anytime you can show that the evidence offered in support of the claim is false, the argument's fallacious because it violates this principle. It violates the T in the refute rule. Now, one way of attacking that is by going through each one of the premises one at a time, but another way, an indirect way of attacking an argument on the basis of the T in the refute rule is to show that some of the evidence is inconsistent, that the evidence can't all be true at the same time. Inconsistent evidence is always bad evidence. And again, think about a trial. If I'm an attorney and you're in the witness stand and I get you to be inconsistent, what that means and what the jury is going to take away from that is that not everything you've said is true. If a set of statements is inconsistent, they can't all possibly be true. Inconsistent evidence is always bad evidence. And inconsistent evidence always violates the T. So I'm just letting you know. One of the things that you can do in order to show that someone's argument is bad is by showing that some of their evidence is false. And one way of doing that is by asking or determining whether the evidence is consistent. If you can show that the evidence is inconsistent, you can attack it. But your job when you're evaluating an argument isn't to go through and prove that your opponent's evidence is true or false. I mean, the point is, if you can show that some of the evidence is false or inconsistent, you've got something sufficient in order to show why the argument's fallacious. But here, consider this argument. Water is CO2 and pigs cannot fly, therefore pigs cannot fly. Is a valid argument, but it's not a good argument. And the reason why it's not a good argument is it violates the principle that says the evidence offered in support of the claim needs to be true. And the reason why it's bad evidence here is because, well, water is not CO2. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a very explicit example, but we'll see how this works. So is the evidence true? Well, if you can show that it isn't, you've got good grounds for proving that the argument's bad. Another way, like I said, is to ask, is the evidence consistent? Consider this argument. There are 2,468 Texans named Billy Bob. It is false that there are 2,468 Texans named Billy Bob. Therefore, God exists. Is a valid argument. Why is it valid? Because it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. And why is it impossible for the premises to be true? Because they're inconsistent. Anytime you have inconsistent evidence, trivially speaking, your argument's going to be valid. But it will always be bad because it violates the T. That is the principle that says that the evidence needs to be true. Does this make sense? Looking for consistencies and inconsistencies is a good and reasonable thing to do when your job is to evaluate an argument. Another thing to note, logically speaking, that anytime the evidence is inconsistent, any claim whatsoever in the universe follows from it. So you want to guarantee a valid argument? Offer an argument with inconsistent evidence, but it will always be fallacious. So we'll get to that principle in a second. So I'm going to ignore. In fact, the inconsistency doesn't always have to be sort of explicit. It can be implied. Like, for instance, number 6, you are a teenager, you are an adult, you are middle-aged. What's inconsistent about that set of statements? Because what? That's true, but you can't you can't, that is, as it applies to you, you can't be a teenager, an adult, and middle-aged all at the same time, right? In any event. We've mentioned this particular fallacy before, but there's another principle of good reasoning. Again, you've got the cardinal principles that says the truth of the claim needs to follow from the truth of the evidence. Another principle that says the evidence needs to be true, right? Another principle is that the evidence offered in support of the claim needs to be independent of the claim. Now, this doesn't mean in an absolute sense that it has to be independent of it. Otherwise, the evidence wouldn't be relevant to the claim. What this is getting at is that anytime you argue, you're trying to show that your claim is true. You can't do that if you assume the truth of the very thing you're trying to show to be true as part of your evidence. When you do that, you're committing an error in reasoning called begging the question. That's always bad. Your premises will always be assumptions, but never look at your claim as an assumption, and never think of yourself as, well, I'm assuming that my claim is true. Well, maybe you are, right? But when you argue, your job is to show that your claim is true. You can't do that by assuming that your claim is true without begging the question, and that's always bad. So for instance, the Capitol is in Washington, D.C., therefore the Capitol is in Washington, D.C. It is true that God exists, therefore God exists. Valid. Again, impossible for the premise to be true, for the claim to be false, if the premise and the conclusion are one and the same statement, but always fallacious. You may not, ought not, should not assume the truth of the very thing you're trying to show to be true. When you do that, you're going to beg the question. Now, your claim, or at least a component of your claim, will always occur somewhere else in your argument. Otherwise, it wouldn't be, there wouldn't be any logical relation between your premises and your conclusion. And unlike the cases I just showed you, where God exists, therefore God exists, or the Capitol's in Washington, D.C., therefore Capitol's in Washington, D.C., well, that's obvious, right? More often than not, when begging the question occurs, it occurs because the premise is a restatement of the conclusion. It's a different sentence that asserts essentially the same thing. Every American is a U.S. citizen, blah, 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 blah. Therefore, if someone is an American, then he or she is a U.S. citizen. Two different sentences assert the same thing. Begging the question, always bad. All right. Is the evidence unambiguous? Well, the thing about language is we can use language for all kinds of wonderful things, and we can use language for all kinds of bad and despicable things. But when you're trying to show that your claim is true, you can't do that if there's a shift in meaning, intentional or otherwise, that occurs within the context of the argument. I only identify 3 fallacies of ambiguity, but the fallacies are fallacies because of this principle that says that the evidence must be unambiguous. That is, you may not use the same word, term, or what have you, in different senses, that is, in different connotations within the same argument. Otherwise, there's a shift in meaning that occurs, and that's always bad. So, you won't see many examples of this one. But amphibole is one of them. I'm mentioning it only because it's a cool name, and they're typically humorous when they occur. And I've been to, 42 countries. I've seen lots of unintentional examples of amphibole, usually in terms of translations of signs and whatnot. But amphibole is a fallacy of ambiguity that occurs when 2 conditions are met. You've got a sentence that has more than one meaning because of the loose or ungrammatical or awkward way in which it's constructed. And then the second condition is that someone makes an inference, draws a conclusion on the basis of the obviously false or unintended interpretation. So, headline, unarmed man shot dead by police twice this week. Someone says, well, that's one unlucky unarmed man. Well, because it didn't mean the same guy got shot dead, right? I like the Zurich sign one. A couple looks at their sign in the Zurich hotel, which reads, because of the impropriety of entertaining guests of the opposite sex in the bedroom, it is suggested that the lobby be used for this purpose. And the woman says, well, Hans, I'm game if you're game. I don't think the hotel wants them to get busy on the couches, in the lobby, right? And then there was some stills from a Miller Lite commercial from a number of years ago. The idea is that amphibole is, it's almost always funny, right? But basically, you don't have just something that means more than one thing because of the ungrammatical way in which it's constructed. Someone has to make an inference on the basis of the obviously false or unintended interpretation. More commonly, what's going to happen will be this: equivocation. You will encounter, well, hopefully you won't encounter too many of these. But again, I want to get through some of these named ones because you're going to encounter some, I think you're going to encounter some versions of these. Equivocation occurs because there's a shift in meaning that happens within the argument, because a word or a phrase will mean one thing in one place but something else in another, and you may not do that. So if Albert Pujols is a cardinal, then he has red feathers. Albert Pujols is a cardinal, therefore Albert Pujols has red feathers. Obviously, I need to change my example since he's no longer a cardinal. But the idea is that the term cardinal is being equivocated. That it means one thing in one context and it means something else in the other. That is, one is a name of a bird, the other is name of a Major League Baseball player or someone that plays on a particular team. Take a look at number 2 here. Jane is a good professor. Consequently, she will be a good college president. What term is being equivocated in that item number 2 there?
Professor, college president.
No, that's not the term that's being... Good. Good is being equivocated. That is, what it means to be a good professor is different than what it means to be a good college president. So it doesn't follow that someone's going to be a good college president just because you're a good professor. Here's another example. Lionfish are millions of years old. The National Aquarium has a lionfish. Thus, the National Aquarium in Baltimore has a fish that's millions of years old. Where's the equivocation occurring here?
It's a bee.
No.
Lionfish.
Lionfish as an individual and then lionfish as a species.
Exactly right. Do you see this? Okay. Again, I've got 15 minutes. I'm not going to teach you all this in 15 minutes. Half-truth, be aware of it. Half-truth occurs when, through the use of ellipses or typographical emphasis, something ends up saying one thing when it actually means something else, and that's always bad. But I'm going to skip this and get to the next fallacy, or kind of fallacy, which are going to be the fallacies of presumption. And I need to pause here because, again, you can't have an argument without assumptions. You can't. And from the standpoint of the evaluation of the argument, the premises are always going to be assumptions because those are going to be statements that you're assuming to be true but not showing to be true. The statement you're trying to show to be true is going to be the claim, the conclusion. So calling something an assumption or a supposition or presupposition is not to call it a bad name. But when you assume the truth of something that's both unproven and unreasonable, that's a dubious assumption. And the principle here is that the evidence needs to be free of dubious assumption. It can't be free of assumptions. So either you are a Democrat or you're a Republican. It is false that you're a Democrat, therefore you're a Republican. It's valid because it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the claim to be false. But the reason why it's bad is because it violates this principle. And the reason why it commits a dubious assumption is because there are more alternatives than the 2 limited alternatives that you're being presented with. So the fallacies of presumption, you'll always be able to identify something that's being presupposed, not necessarily stated explicitly, but where that presupposition is dubious, that is, it's unreasonable. So the fallacies of presumption identify ways in which assumptions can be dubious. One of them is to occurs when you argue from a general rule, but you apply it to an atypical case where the rule doesn't apply. The fallacy is called accident. And notice that as we go through some of these examples, you'll always be able to identify what the dubious assumption is. So you can phrase it in different ways. So the sign says no swimming, hence it would be wrong to go swimming even to save this child's life. That is, applying a general rule to this atypical case where the rule doesn't apply is unreasonable. It's a dubious assumption. Dad said never to wake him. He was sleeping when his boss called. That's why I did not tell Dad that he would be fired if he did not go into work this morning. Dad said don't do it, so I didn't do it. Well, that's unreasonable, right? Take a look at this one. This is another thing that happens in science fairly often, not as often as false cause, so we're going to get to that in a second. Hasty generalization is a fallacy of presumption that occurs when you argue from a particular or atypical case or a small sample and form an unqualified generalization that applies in all cases. So it was necessary for Steve to swim in the creek in order to save his son's life. Thus, anyone should be able to swim in the creek at any time. Hasty generalization. Sophie is a cat. Sophie likes tuna. Thus, all cats love tuna. Hasty generalization. Marijuana eases the pain of those afflicted with glaucoma and AIDS. Therefore, smoking marijuana will ease anyone's pain. Hasty generalization. All right, we've already talked about complex question. Complex question occurs when you dubiously assume an answer to a prior question that wasn't even asked. And the intelligent procedure for dealing with these questions is to point out the complexity of the question. Like, do you still beat your wife? You would say, well, that's a complex question. You're assuming that I used to beat my wife. I never have, nor do I beat her now. That's an intelligent response to that question, not yes or no, because then you're screwed. Composition and division. And you're going to see examples of this. But composition occurs when you argue that what's true of the parts is going to be true of the whole. Division occurs when you argue that what's true of the whole is going to be true of the parts. And it's bad. They're both dubious assumptions. Everything in the universe was created by something. Thus, the universe was created by something. Is an example of composition. Each member of the orchestra plays well, so the orchestra will play well. It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow that what's true of the parts is going to be true of the whole. And similarly, division. The U.S. is a wealthy nation. You are a U.S. citizen, thus you must be wealthy. It doesn't follow that what's true of the whole is going to be true of the parts. So composition occurs when you dubiously assume that what's true of the parts is true of the whole. Division occurs when you dubiously assume that what's true of the whole is going to be true of the parts. And again, let's remind ourselves, science is in the business of providing explanations for why the world is the way it is, why it was the way it was, and how it's going to be in the future. And sometimes dubious assumptions will be made as a part of the evidence for the claims that are being made. False dilemma you've already seen. False cause, again, I want to pause because, again, science is in the business of explaining why the world was the way it was, why it is the way it is, and how it's going to be in the future. So causality is going to be a concept that we're going to be considering here. And not all assumptions about causality are reasonable. In fact, there are three ways in which false cause can occur, but false cause essentially is a catch-all fallacy of presumption that occurs whenever someone mistakes something that is not the cause for the cause of something. Now, one way this can occur is this post hoc ergo propter hoc. I'm not going to hold you responsible for the Latin. But the idea is that after this, therefore, because of this. Grandma listened to Howard Stern before her operation and she survived. Therefore, listening to Howard Stern saved Grandma's life. That is, it doesn't follow that something's the cause of something just because it happened prior to it. The team rallied after the players turned around their caps. Thus, turning their caps around caused them to rally. False cause. So again, false cause can occur or will occur anytime you attribute the cause of something when it's not the cause of it. And one way is to say, well, one thing's the cause of something else because it happened prior to it. Another way is to say, this cum hoc ergo propter hoc, that because these two things always happen together, that one's the cause of the other. So I say that even if two events occur together, might there not be some third events that the cause of them both? So for instance, an increase in crime always occurs during an increase in snow cone sales. Therefore, an increase in snow cone sales causes an increase in crime. Because it's true. Increases in crime do coincide with increases in snow cone sales. But it's not the snow cones, it's the heat, right? Does that make sense? Right? This is the more common version of it. And again, think about it. Any two statements can be conjoined with if-then. And what conditional statements capture, in part, is a kind of causal relation that exists between the antecedent and the consequent. So what the larger conditional statement's asserting is that if this is the case, then this will happen, be true, occur. So when this is the case and this thing doesn't happen, what the larger conditional is asserting is false. Because the only way of making a conditional false is when the antecedent is true and the consequence false. But again, any two statements can be conjoined with if-then. Sophie is a cat. The moon is not made of green cheese. If Sophie is a cat, then the moon is not made of green cheese. Now, when you're concerned with whether it's true or false, all that matters is the truth value of the antecedent in relation to the consequent. But if you're concerned with whether what's being asserted is reasonable, then there needs to be some kind of causal or other relation between the two of them. Yes, James?
Number 6b, if a hurricane strikes Nebraska this year, then lions aren't carnivores?
Take a look at 5 first. If Homer Simpson isn't president of the United States, then pigs cannot fly. Homer Simpson isn't president of the United States, therefore pigs cannot fly. Notice the first premise there was a conditional. What possible causal or other relation exists between a cartoon character being president and the flying ability of pigs, right? Any two statements can be conjoined with if-then, but the result isn't always going to be something that's going to be reasonable. In the case of the second, if lions are carnivores, then no hurricane will strike Nebraska this year. Lions are carnivores. Accordingly, no hurricane will strike Nebraska this year. What's unreasonable about the conditional here?
Yeah, it's the premise. I was just saying, like, number 5, you've proved that it's dubious by taking the inverse. With number 6, you just restated the premise.
Well, that is it possible for hurricanes to occur in Nebraska? No.
Oh, I didn't know.
No, you can get tornadoes, but they can't get a hurricane. So it's unreasonable. I mean, it's a dubious causal relation that exists between the two of them. Let's see. Again, although any two statements can be conjoined into a conditional, not just any two statements can be conjoined into an assumption that's going to be reasonable. So I've got 5 minutes left. How's about number 2? The universe is spherical in form because all the constituent parts of the universe, that is the sun, the moon, and the planets, appear in this form. What's the conclusion of the argument that's asserted in number 2?
The universe is spherical.
Exactly right. And how do you know that?
Because all the constituent parts of the universe appear in this form.
Now, what specifically is in the passage that lets you know that that's the conclusion? Because is a premise indicator, which means that what follows it is going to be the premise, which means that this thing that went before it is going to be the conclusion. I mean, you got to look at it that way. All right, what's wrong with this argument?
Composition.
It's composition. Why?
Because it's assuming that the individual parts, what's true about the individual parts are true about the whole.
Exactly right. What about number 4? As the eye, the hand, the foot, and similarly, each part of the body has a special function, so may man be regarded as having a special function apart from all these. Aristotle. So what's the conclusion of the argument we have at number 4?
Man may be regarded as having a special function.
And what's the reason given in order to show that it's true?
Because the eye, the hand, the foot, and similarly each part has a special function.
And I paraphrase. Because all the parts of the man have a special function, therefore man has a special function. Feel free to paraphrase, right? Not just go word for word. What's wrong with this argument?
Composition again.
Is it composition too?
Yep.
Yes. Going from the parts to the whole. How's about... keep focused on composition division. I did this one in my last class, so I won't do that one again. No, in fact, I'll do that. This is a good one. I just read What Makes a Man Propose. Let me highlight it so you can see it. And all I have to say is, why wait for them to do it? I proposed to my fiancé on the spur of the moment using a ring I made out of a silver wrapper of a piece of gum. He was shocked, but a big smile came over his face and he said yes. Since then, I have given him a real engagement ring, but he still has the original foil one in a personal album. More women should take matters into their own hands. It worked for me. So what's the claim that's being made here?
It worked for her.
That's a reason. That's not the claim. What's the claim that's being made? What's the conclusion?
More women should do this foil thing.
And the reason is, it worked for me. What's the fallacy that's being committed here?
Hasty generalization.
Hasty generalization. Are you seeing how this works? Right? There's some good ones there, but they get longer. All right, here's what we'll do. At the beginning of class on Thursday, I'll review some of these important fallacies of relevance, these non sequiturs. And then that's about as much as I can do in terms of equipping you with some important skills to evaluate, to recognize and to evaluate arguments. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the scientific method, and you're going to see some explicit arguments here and why there are some advantages to symbolizing arguments. And that will take care of the foundation groundwork stuff, and then we're going to start focusing our attention on the actual articles for the rest of the semester. So anyone have any questions for me? I will post a 1-minute argument question. In fact, what I think I'm going to do is have you send, maybe I'll wait. I'll let you know what's going to happen. All right, I'm not going to post a 1-minute argument question today, but I will for Thursday. And that question is going to ask you to go forth into the world, identify a small passage like the ones you've seen where the argument is fallacious and where you can tell me why it's fallacious. Okay? And I may even narrow your focus to arguments having to do with the kinds of topics we're going to be covering in this class, like having to do with the difference between genuine science and pseudoscience, or whether, for instance, intelligent design is a genuine science, nature of theories, arguing against the inclusion of the theory of evolution or privileging it because it's just a theory. I think we'll be able to limit the topics to these science-related ones, and I guarantee you're still going to be able to find examples of these fallacious arguments. Okay, any questions for me? All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday.